like Sam said, tonight I'm going to be talking about the history of the book and sort of trying to place it in the larger geographical and historical context and cultural context of the subsequent centuries since its advent. And then we're going to focus on some common problems and their solutions. Okay. So on this slide, I wanted to kind of just go over some basic terminology since I'm going to be throwing a lot of words at you. So starting in that bottom right corner, we're just going to go over the edges of a book since they're just sort of our cardinal directions when we talk about them. So the side of the book that usually faces you when you're looking at the shelf, that is the spine. And then that top edge is the head. The edge opposite the spine is the foredge where you would open the book. And then that bottom edge is the tail. When you open a book, there's usually a piece of paper adhered to that board, and that's called the paste down. And the paste down can hide a multitude of things. And it's usually going to obscure the point at which the text block, which is often paper with the written word, how it is attached to the boards. And so in the two photos at the bottom, you can see that there are layers of paper under the red paste down. And then that bottom right photo is missing a paste down, but would have one, would cover where it is laced in. And it sort of pulls the curtain over all of the hardware. And then there are multiple ways that a book can be made. We're going to be talking about that, but the two examples on top just kind of show some of the layers that it takes to create a book. And there are multiple sewing support types. Here you can see some linen or some fabric tapes and some cord, as well as the layers of board and covering material. So we're going to try and peel that away just to give everybody a sense of what's changed over time. Within the book itself, we're talking about a text block, and a text block is made up of, we're often used to paper, but there are multiple materials that I'll talk about. And usually we're thinking of them as nested groups of material. And so in this case, I'm showing an example of paper. There are multiple pages of paper that can get folded and inserted into each other. And from multiple wire or multi-section books, just where you have multiple of those nested groups, they get stacked together and then sewn. And the sewing tends to come in and out of the section itself. So you can kind of see that on the final image. There's the sewing on the inside of that section of multiple papers. So just trying to think about that. When I talk about manuscripts, which are handwritten, we're talking about quires. And then during the printed era of the book, beginning of the 15th century, we'll talk about sections and gatherings. Okay. So in addition to paper, which I mentioned, there are multiple substrates that we can impart information. We can use for information, display, and exchange. So with paper is one, and that was developed in about 105 CE officially from China. But thinking about the earliest options, clay tablets and wax tablets are sort of offer us two really nice contrasting options, because clay tablets, they would have had words inscribed, they would have been fired in the sun and hardened, and they would have been permanent. Whereas wax tablets have the ability to be, the wax could be softened and raised and then information reapplied. So it's this idea of permanent versus impermanent material, materiality and information projection. And so we're kind of thinking that in terms of the book, we know as much about the book as we have physical evidence for. And so when we think about the history of the book, it has to be a flexible kind of subject, because we are finding more archaeological evidence for books, but we're also limited by what we do know. And so some books may have been recycled, materials reused, whereas some of them have sort of remained. So it's just kind of considering we don't know everything, and we're sort of adding to the research. And then two other materials we're going to talk about a lot. So parchment, which is a paper, an animal skin product, and papyrus, which is a plant-based product. And both of those are seen in the earlier book formats as before paper becomes more common. So here's a really rough timeline of the history of the book. And we're not going to cover everything, both what is shown and what's not shown. But I just want you to know that it's not a linear timeline by any means. So when I talk about the history of the book, I'm referring to the codex format. The codex is a group of materials. So we saw those quires and sections, the nested materials that are gathered and secured along the spine edge in a way that allows you to open it from that foredge and read the information. So the initial technologies that people had for information exchange were scrolls, rolls, were wax tablets, were different forms of what you might consider bindings, but not considered codex. And so I want you to just kind of, there's a difference, and I'm just going to be referring to what we now think of as like the book format when I talk about the history of the book. All right, and then based on that definition of codex, where it's secured at the spine edge, this is kind of where having to be a little bit flexible comes in handy, because we are finding these examples where it's not the material we would expect, but it seems that they have been created in a way that fits that definition. So we have this example from the 7th century, which are a series of wax tablets that have holes drilled in a way that may suggest they were sewn together, which would fall under that definition of codex. So it's possible that the idea for that codex, that book form, has existed for far longer than we know, and it has taken shape in ways that we might not necessarily expect. But what we are seeing could just be a glimpse of what has existed. So the early codices, the rise of the codex, seems to have been linked with the rise and spread of Christianity, and then other religions kind of took that technology and adapted it and spread it as they moved through geography. There's literary reference to the codex format by Roman authors, but without the physical evidence, it's really hard to confirm this. Other religions, especially the Jewish religion, which is ancient, we just don't have a very robust remaining example of ancient texts. And so it's hard to say when their codex binding traditions began. And so it's a bit of a gray area open for scholarship. But again, it's just based on the archaeological evidence available. And to that extent, we have fragments of things, but it's hard to construct and determine what a complete binding would have looked at just based on that fragmentary evidence.
Excuse me, can you talk about what was in the books over the historical?
Sure.
Why they were being published and what?
Yeah. So funny you mentioned that. We will come on to it, but they tended to be, from what survives, they're religious. And a lot of that is because monasteries provided safe places, tended to be stone or brick, and so they weren't burning down as much, and they were the people who were investing the time and resources into creating the objects. And so the first known binding that we have is from the 3rd and 4th century. It's found in Egypt, which tends to be a place a lot of these materials are found because it's so dry, and when they're kept out of the sun, it creates a really nice kind of preservation environment. There were 13 codices found, tended to be very long and rectangular, and they could either be limp leather, so there was just sort of a leather wrap, or they had a degree of papyrus kind of stuffed in to help stiffen the leather. 12 of the 13 are just that one group of nested pages, so single quire, and they had a wraparound to keep that book nice and tight. In contrast, we're beginning to see development into the multi-quire books, and they, for the next several books I talk about, there's going to be overlapping patterns that you're going to see. So they tended to have just thread and the substrate, so what we would consider unsupported sewing. The text block would have been papyrus and then parchment, and they would have had wooden or papyrus boards on top of that text block. It seems that there was adhesive used to connect the text block to the cover, and there's a leather spine. There are other elements to the book that are sort of hard to determine exactly, so just evidence of, but we know that most of the books found from this period are from the Coptic tradition, which is a Christian sect in Egypt. And a lot of the books that survived are because they were in those monasteries, and so would have had religious teachings within them. We're trying to move away from calling it Coptic binding because it's unclear if this was the broader tradition of the period and the geography, and this is just one subsect that survived, or if this was a specific binding style to the Coptic religion. So we're just considering them proto-case bindings because of that adhesive attachment. Having just said that, we still call them late Coptic bindings, so we're still working on it. But these span sort of the 7th to 11th centuries. And again, you're going to see a lot of that same unsupported link stitch sewing. But now we're starting to attach the boards in a more secure manner, so with that same thread that they use for sewing. And you can either attach the board as you sew or after. The boards would have been Papyrus, again, a lot of these books are coming from Egypt, and Egypt was the main producer of papyri at the time. They could be wooden boards, a little bit of whatever material the binder had at hand, and sometimes it was two boards sort of adhered or laminated together. And you can see that in the diagram, two boards with a material sort of sandwiched in between. There were spine linings, so tends to be fabric or parchment that goes over the spine side of the quires and sort of helps cinch it together nice and tight. And end bands. So end bands are a sewn element, and you can see in this diagram at the head and tail ends at the spine, and they would extend from the board onto the text block to the second board. And it became a really strong sort of attachment method. Significant decoration, so now they're not just about the information held within the book, there's also an aesthetic element, and perhaps a devotional one as well if they're in the monasteries. And then you have fasteners and bookmarks included to help keep the text box cinched. So thinking about the rise, the correlation between the rise of the Codex and the spread of Christianity, I just wanted to show in about the 600s what that spread looked like. And so it's a really large geographical area. And so there's going to be a lot of overlap in the regional binding cultures, but also differences based on materials available and sort of aesthetic taste of the time. So one of the main binding styles that we know is the Ethiopic, and this began in about the 4th century when it became a Christian sect and has continued pretty much uninterrupted into the 20th century. So it's a very long binding tradition. It's always a parchment text block. It's always that same unsupported sewing. Except they were using gut instead of vegetable thread, so it was a bit stiffer, so they did not need to use needles to sew. They have really thick wooden boards that might be slightly shaped, but the boards would be attached with that sewing. In the diagram at the top, there's sort of a window into the spine, so you can see the sewing and that there is no spine lining. There's an end band element. There are additions into the side of the book that would have helped protect illustrations. So these again would have been religious materials with paintings. And so this would have helped protect the pigment. And then a leather cover and tooling. And then interestingly, these books bags were made for these books so that they could be portable devices. So people were traveling with these. They weren't just staying on the shelf. There's a Byzantine variation, which has links to the Byzantine Empire, but sort of extended beyond both the geographical confines and the time confines of the empire. But you're seeing the same unsupported sewing. The boards are again sewn with the text block or often, but you're seeing sort of that lightning bolt Z shape is channels cut into the board to eliminate the sewing thread, and so it no longer is raised above. You have a nice round spine instead of just that flat spine we were seeing earlier. And that happens naturally when you sew the text block with the boards. There's a spine lining that now extends far enough onto the text block that it can be used as a point of attachment between the board and the text block. So now you're getting 3 points of contact between the text block and the board, the sewing, the end band, which, as you can see, is prominently protruding on the diagram, and the spine lining. So these books are really strong, and they're intended for use, and they're intended to stay intact. Again, you have a leather covering, some blind tooling, and some fasteners to keep the books shut tight. And then finally, one of the other main or big variations is the Armenian. Again, this is a country that became Christian in about the 4th century. The earliest known manuscripts are roughly from the 7th or 8th, but these characteristics tend to be from about the 13th century on, as the binding style really became cemented. So it was parchment and then paper text block. So paper is a resource that is coming westward from China. So we know those travel routes are open and being explored. They begin to use double cord supports. And you can see in that diagram, there's a raised support that the sewing goes around and that sort of stops the thread from pulling through the paper so easily. There are wooden boards that end at the same dimensions as the text block that could be shaped. But they were also importantly connected to the text block via the sewing supports. So it's not just a thread, it's now that thick cord that it's attaching the book, the board to the text block. There's structural end bands, and again, just to note that Chinese connection, they tend to be using silk thread, and so that's another resource coming westward. So these binding styles are being influenced by the resources available. Edge decoration is possible, as well as decoration on the leather covers. And then later on in the centuries, you're beginning to see metalwork, which gives it sort of a nice aesthetic touch. So moving to the rise of Islam, this was began in about the 7th century and it became a really dominant force. And as such, they were going to be carrying a lot of the book culture into new geographies over a vast amount of time. And so thinking about this again, the characteristics are sort of the common characteristics, but there's a bunch of regional variation, which is very interesting. So typically parchment and then burnished paper. The burnished paper is extremely characteristic of the Islamic binding, and it would be polished, so it's very shiny, and the ink sits on top of the paper instead of being absorbed into the fibers, because the fibers now lay very flat. You're seeing that same unsupported sewing, spine linings, structural, and then wooden boards. The wooden boards, as in many binding traditions, will become paper-based boards as paper becomes cheaper and more accessible. But the linings are really important because they are the connection point between the boards and the text block. And so in addition to the structural end, the lining now becomes that main connecting point. The cover material is most often leather, and the boards can either be covered separately from being attached to the text block or when they're attached. If they're covered separately, both boards have an extension of leather that when put on the board overlap on the spine. So sometimes you can see that detail if you look closely. Some books, the leather was cut to the same dimension as the book. Others had an extra tab of leather at the spine, and then they were commonly decorated. The style shown on the screen here has what is known as a forage flap and an envelope flap, and it's that sort of triangular protrusion, and that will sit under the front board, and they're opened right to left, and so it's another protection for that book. And then one of the other major religions of the period was Buddhism, beginning in India, but importantly extending into China, and then from China into Korea and Japan. And those three countries have a really interlaced, interconnected history. So their book cultures share a lot of the similarities. So there are some very, very early examples of bindings found in the Danhuang caves. They're located outside of what would have been the center of the Chinese Empire at the time. So it's not quite, no one quite knows why the cave is full of books or whose books they are. And it seems that there are styles there that aren't necessarily reflected in the Chinese traditions seen at the center of the empire. So it seems like it could have been a very easy trading point and sort of location for the convergence of multiple peoples and traditions. I want to reiterate, as I said at the beginning, where it's not a linear timeline. There are a lot of older forms that people are still using as new forms develop. So just because the scroll doesn't have the same sort of practicality as a bound codex, people have not gotten rid of it. And so you find that a lot in the Chinese tradition of binding styles are becoming related to the materials they talk about. So the Buddhist texts that are associated with a certain type of binding. And so that is their binding. And even as new bindings emerge, those ones are still in play. So the cave had a lot of variations. It seems that the first multi-quire codex was from the 8th century, and that would be that top image, and it had thread running through. But it doesn't seem to have a predecessor in the Chinese tradition or a successor. So no one's really sure where it fits into the timeline. But it seems that the first codex that was regularly used in Asia, or in China, was the butterfly binding. And this is sort of like our modern day adhesive binding, where the paper was folded in half and the folded edge became the spine, and it was glued to other spines to form that text block. So it's sort of interesting. You're seeing a lot of elements of books we have currently being sort of portrayed in the earlier periods. These books responded to demands of the secular commercial cultures in China. And so you're seeing more people as the paper making became more commonplace and woodblock printing was invented in the 9th century. These books are becoming formatted to respond to the need for cheap book product. But because they're a little bit cheaper, that adhesive falls apart often. So by the 14th century, people have set on a sewn style. And what they've done, interestingly, is the folded edge that was the spine is that now reversed and becomes the foredge of the text block. The paper, the quires, the sections are stacked, and paper twists, which you can kind of think of staples, is inserted through. It becomes the main format by which the text block is connected together. Chinese books tend to have this blue as their paper, and they would have had a thread, and the sewing stations are always at this very particular ratio, as sort of a hallmark to Chinese binding. In Korea, you're seeing a similar product a little bit earlier in the 13th century, but you're also seeing the same early formats that we're seeing in China. Again, you have the same foredge is now that folded edge. The covers tended to be layers of older paper covered with one nice paper, so sort of an economy that was taken. The paper was typically embossed with designs to make it more presentable, but interestingly, they used beeswax on the paper, and this made it water resistant, abrasion resistant, and was a natural insecticide. And they sort of brought that into the book by waxing the thread prior to sewing. So it was just sort of a really interesting element that we don't necessarily see in other bindings. And the Korean bindings tended to have 5 sewing stations as opposed to the 4. And then to round off the 3, we have the Japanese bindings. Japan seems to have used that early multi-sewn Chinese codex format that we didn't actually see being used in China that often. So it was clearly there was some sort of transit of information between China and Japan through Korea, likely. But by the 14th century, you have again that same style. Japan has 4 holes, and they tend to use different paper colors to indicate the subject matter. So different. Just visually, you could determine what was inside of those books. So I really want to emphasize that the books are not existing in a vacuum and that they are responding to demands by people. By the 13th century, there is a globalization, not to a small degree, there's a large trade, and we're seeing that in the resources that are being shared as well as the technologies. And so book binding, the form of the codex, it's needed to travel, it's needed to spread and convert people. And so these conversations are happening, and you're going to keep seeing those interconnected elements. All right, so moving back in time just a little bit, back to Europe, there are 2 main European medieval structures. We have Carolingian structures, which are the 8th to 12th century, and then the Romanesque, which is 11th to 14th. Both of these shared similarities. There was always a parchment text block that would have been pre-punched prior to sewing, whereas before people might just be sewing punching holes as they sew. So more formatting. The Carolingian book seems to have had a move in the direction of a sewing frame, and so what they would do is they would lace in the front board with cords, which they were using for support, and then it kind of provided a platform that they could sew the text block on. By the Romanesque period, we're seeing an actual sewing frame develop. And so this is a 3-sided structure with a platform, and it allows you to stretch out the sewing supports and make them taut so that you can sew around it and use both hands instead of trying to hold a support with one hand and sew. So we know that people are spending the time to improve on the amount of time it takes and the resources being put into making books. So it's becoming more of a book culture. They're using wooden boards. The wooden boards have round channels to accommodate the cord for the earlier Carolingian books and rectangular channels for the Romanesque. And then the manner of covering seems to have been that the paste down would go and then the leather covering would go over that for the Carolingian, whereas for the Romanesque, they were buying the cover material and then putting down the paste down. So there are differences in binding techniques being explored. The covers were leather, as I mentioned. The Carolingian period, it seems that a lot of the leather was from wild animal skin, whereas by the Romanesque period, since a lot of these books are being created in monasteries, the monasteries now have sort of established herds of grazing animals that they would have both for the meat and for the skin. And so again, you're seeing that development in the resources being put forward to the book culture. Some decoration on the covers, fasteners, and then in that bottom image you can see that they're beginning to add more decorative elements. So they're adding these metal inclusions on the covers. Okay, the think this is my last map. So the point to be made here is that by the 15th century, the printing press is in Europe. People are communicating. There's a lot of information exchange. As you can see, a bunch of travel routes. And there is the rise of the professional bookbinder. With that comes the need to meet the greater demand for book production and inevitably a reduction in the quality of work as people are beginning to churn out more books. And that will be a very important theme as we continue. So in the 15th century, the books are still really strong. You're having a parchment and a paper textbook. Again, as paper becomes more common in the West, people will transition to it because it is cheaper. You're having a lot of animal-based sewing supports, and then cords become common for fabric. You have flat spines with spine linings, and those will extend far enough that the board can be attached, as we saw earlier. The wooden boards are now slightly larger in dimension than the text block, so they extend beyond and create sort of a protection for that text block itself. And the boards are attached to the text block via nailing in the sewing supports or using wooden pegs in those holes to sort of hold them in place. There are leather covers, but people are now paying more attention to how nicely they cover the books because they are now being sold. So you want to obviously get the most money for your work. And then there's more decoration occurring. By the mid to end of the 15th century, they're adding gold onto the covers. It's a real eye-catching element. And then there are just some regional differences, especially as we can see in the fasteners. Italy and Spain, their fasteners go from the top to bottom and they connect to the bottom, whereas Northern Europe, they were coming off the backboard and attaching on the top. So they're just fun little elements like that. By the 16th century, again, we're seeing that sort of shift in the books. They're becoming smaller, they're becoming lighter. People are traveling with them more. They're predominantly paper. The sewing support, they're beginning to move away from using animal product to just the boards or the fabric. The end bands, which were once really important structural components, are now beginning to have fewer attachment points on the text block, those still being used to connect the text block to the boards. The spines are beginning to be lined with glue or starch-based adhesive, and they still have those spine linings. The boards are now, some are wood, but a lot of them are paper-based boards, which help to make them a lighter product. And then you're beginning to see more decorative elements. So the edges can be decorated, so the head, forehead, and tail edges. There are new there are new colors of leather that are tended to be used. Again, more tooling, more decoration. And we're also beginning to see the start of putting letters on the spine. Whereas previously, sort of the foredge of the book might be facing you on a shelf. We're now seeing the spine facing you. At about this time, you're beginning to see the expansion of European settlers. And so in Latin America, the Spanish are coming into Peru and Mexico. Prior to their arrival, there is a binding style, again, not codex, but a binding style. The Mayans and Aztecs are using a model, which is a bark where the fibers are pulverized, formed into flat sheets, and then they're drawn upon and they're created into these accordion bindings, which you can see are sort of long connected papers that are creased and open and fold. Open and expand as you pull the boards open. But the Spanish bindings in the area tended to be paper. They tended to have inconsistent sewing, so kind of a quick and dirty version, but they were still obviously very stable because we have so many examples. The end bands tended to be fairly plain, no decorative elements. The covers tended to be parchment with no boards, and the parchment would be turned in on itself with quite wide margins that would help make them a little bit stronger. So think of it as almost double thickness. And then you had some edge decoration, hand titling. Again, a lot of these books were held in monastery collections, and so they would have been branded with a hot iron to sort of mark the property of each monastery. And they had a toggle and loop system to keep the board shut. As printing and binding developed in other Latin American countries over the subsequent decades and centuries, they tended to parallel what was happening in Europe. So in Europe in the 17th century, At this point, book production has kicked into a high gear, so you're seeing a lot of aesthetics and sort of, again, a really sharp reduction in mechanical strength elements to the books. So paper text blocks with decorative paper, but you're seeing shortcuts such as abbreviated sewing. So sewing was the point that took the longest when making a book. And so anytime that you could skip sewing through a hole or skip areas of a section, it helps speed up the process. So you're beginning to see large patches where sewing is not included. You are beginning to see recessed chords, so notches are cut into the text block. And instead of those raised chords, the chords are now kind of they're put into that recess to create a flat, smooth spine. But because people have a notion of what a book should look like, the binders are now creating false raised bands. So on the spine piece, they're creating the shape of what used to be a raised chord and it's no longer. So there's an adjustment for what people are expecting without actually putting in that resource addition. And then you also have fewer supports being placed into the board. So some of them are being cut at the shoulder. Otherwise, you're still seeing spine linings. The end bands are, again, they still have fewer attachment points, but are still present. The boards tended to be paper derivatives. The leather covers are moving again in the direction of having more colors and surface treatments. That is sort of becoming an element of the fine bindings. You have lots of design inclusion. There's increased gold tooling, and some books, but not all, they're also having paper covers, which sort of a separate binding tradition, but is worth noting that is quite prominent in the 17th century. So during the 17th century, you're having colonists come over to North America, so there is a burgeoning book binding trade beginning. A lot of the settlers tended to be British, so a lot of the British traditions sort of are the hallmark of early North American bindings. They tended to have sewn supports or sort of stabbed through the text block, a bit aggressive, but they would have had abbreviated sewing to help speed up that process. Again, few tie down points for the end band, so really just aesthetic because people expect to see them, no longer very structural. The boards are often very, very thin wood, and I have an example up here just so you can see later. But yeah, very thin wood. Paper production hadn't really become a commercial property in North America yet. And then there was some decorative element, but they were also using cheap materials. The leather that they used to cover is sheepskin, which is the cheapest leather just because of how it reacts over time. But I should note that this is just the beginning. As the colonies became more established, the binding trade became more innate as people wanted books, and it became a part of the daily life. So moving into the 18th century, we're seeing a lot of the same styles. You're seeing cuts into the paper to accommodate the recessed sewing supports. Some are still raised, but predominantly recessed. Ornate end bands. Again, people are expecting to see end bands, even though, as you can see here, this is the book I have on the table and also in the diagram. Very, very few tie downs, so not really an important element anymore. Spines are being lined with glue and then paper linings, and well, predominantly paper linings, and then those would have an extension onto the boards to help secure the board to the text block still. They are moving away from full leather coverings. Again, this is the economy saving step. Instead of having to prepare full leather skin, you can now add leather just along the spine and then sometimes at the corner. If it's a spine and corner covering, it's what we would consider a half binding. And if it's just the spine element, it is a quarter. But that being said, the leather actually doesn't have to extend halfway onto the board to fit that half binding. So people are taking whatever shortcuts they can to maximize their profits at the time. And then in this 19th century, we see sort of what I was talking about in the very beginning, that proto-case binding. Parts of that are coming back. We're seeing the rise of cloth covering instead of animal skin product. We're seeing the advent of poor quality paper. During this time, chemistry is becoming or beginning to be practiced a lot more enthusiastically. So there's a lot of harsh chemicals being developed, and people are trying to experiment with different fiber sources to create paper. And so the combination of wood pulp and harsh chemicals is creating quite a poor paper support. Machines are beginning to be used in the binding tradition, so we're seeing that for sewing. But we're also again seeing a really ornate element included. So very brightly colored edges. There's very ornate covers. The books are beginning to be rounded and backed, and we did see this in some of the other examples. But rounding and backing is sort of, if you think of a mushroom cap, the book has a nice curve to it, and then it has sort of the textbook sort of cuts in almost as the underside of that cap, and the boys are able to slot into that space and sort of rest really nicely. And so that has been in play for the last few centuries and remains during the 19th century. The end bands may be sewn still, or they're beginning to be machine made. So large stretches of textile might have thread woven around one edge, and people could simply cut them to the width of the text block and just stick them on. And then the cases, as you can see in the diagram, the case and the text block are two separate pieces, and the final step would be to use adhesive to connect the two components. So again, sort of what you were seeing in that 4th century example. And by the 20th century, a lot of the same styles are in play, but there is slightly better paper quality. People have already realized how poor the previous centuries was, and almost every step of the binding process is mechanized, so very hands-off, very profit-driven. And so the bindings are only including the elements that are absolutely necessary to make the binding function. Additionally, you're also seeing the rise of adhesive bindings, which are kind of our paperback style. So just adhesive and not thread is used to secure those fine edges together. Okay, so I appreciate that was a lot of information. But the main takeaway is binding quality gets worse, paper gets worse. And so when you think about your own home library, that is an important thing to consider about the books that you own. But there's also really important external factors that you can control. And so kind of go over those so you know how to take care of your library. So for books, one of the biggest things to keep in mind is that because of the material is organic, it's going to respond to the environment it's in. And high humidity and high temperatures are both problematic because the moisture can aid mold growth, as well as encourage some pests, and it can cause materials to expand and distort. So it's growing. It's truly growing in the air. Conversely, at below 30% relative humidity, the water content of the text block begins to be reduced, and it becomes more brittle. So it's more susceptible to rough handling. And again, it can distort in the opposite direction and shrink. So knowing that any environment with large fluctuations should be avoided. So you're trying to keep books below about 70 degrees Fahrenheit and near about 50% relative humidity. Sometimes that's hard to control, especially in the summer, but it tends to be, if it's an environment that's fairly comfortable for humans, the books are going to be in a better, that would be better for books than sort of storing them elsewhere. If you're looking to keep them in places where the environment can be controlled, and if you're struggling to do that, you can store books in boxes. If they're in plastic bins, you just have to be careful you don't sort of lock in a little cloud, and any moisture trapped in plastic won't be able to evaporate out. Whereas if they're kept in paper boxes or cardboard boxes, again, you want them to be acid-free cardboard, but it can breathe better, but it's also susceptible to spills and stuff because of the paper absorption. So knowing that where you store your books is really important. Again, limiting the environmental fluctuations, so where you are comfortable is pretty good for books. Keeping books away from external walls can be really helpful. External walls can be an easy point where if there's temperature fluctuations, pests can get in, condensation can build up on the wall. So you're looking to have books in an area where there is airflow, and you can avoid that sort of stagnant microclimate beginning to develop. If you store books near pipes or other liquid-containing vessels, just be really conscious about spills or the possibility thereof, or leaks. They're trying to keep them in dry places where they're not going to be susceptible is really important. If you keep them in closets or in closed rooms, if they're safe, that's great, but just know that that can create very stagnant air. So you're looking to have a little bit of airflow. Even just walking past books will help create that exchange. And then if you're in a room with a lot of airborne pollutants, my parents have bookshelves and a wood stove, so there's a lot of soot in the air. So if you know that, you're just trying to keep sort of regularly cleaning the books so that there isn't a large buildup of dirt and dust. So now that you've got them in the perfect room, at the perfect temperature, you need to make sure that they're being stored on the shelf correctly. And so this, obviously you're going to see this when there's most extreme damage, but if the books are stored so that there's nothing covering them, you're getting a lot of dust settling. If you're, and they can be susceptible to leaks. If your books are shelved at the ground level or on the ground, they can be susceptible to spills, but also kicking them, bumping them, any sort of additional foot action. And then if they're poorly shelved, it can really cause damage to the physical binding, the mechanics of it. So what you're looking to do is have some sort of shelf above your books just to sort of minimize how much is falling down on top of them. You're trying to keep the books about 5 inches off the ground if possible. And then you're trying to shelve the books next to books of similar size so they can provide physical support to their neighbor. You're trying to have them kind of packed tightly enough that they're sitting comfortably next to each other, but not so tightly that they're going to abrade every time you take a book off the shelf. So you're just trying to kind of help prop the books up with each other. Pests. There are lots of possibilities for pests. Books, again, are organic materials, very delicious, and offer sort of a buffet for a variety of animals. If we think larger pests, mice use the material for nesting. You can have, if your books are in the attic, lots of people have raccoons or squirrels. So those are also going to kind of, or commonly can cause damage. Cockroaches are eating proteinaceous and starch-based glues, which almost all books do contain. And then you have insects. And so those are divided into boring insects, so tunneling, which you can see in that top image. Bookworms are actually a real thing. And so this would have been larvae that was laid and then tunneled out. Whereas in that second image, you're seeing a grazing insect. And so it kind of walks over the top layer of material and removes it. And for libraries, a big problem is silverfish. And they love dark places, humid places. So again, that regular housekeeping, just to keep things clean, will really reduce the amount of pests you have. Other things like spiders and flies, they can trap dust in the webs, and the dead bodies can get inside books and create food sources for other materials. So again, just trying to keep regular maintenance. And then pets, not all pets, but some pets are prone. That bottom image is some dog ate my homework kind of chewing. And so you're just kind of trying to keep them out of reach of pets. So as far as helpful solutions, again, cleaning is really important. If you think you have some presence, you can put traps out and just see what you do have. Airflow will help kind of turn over any sort of humidity that's lingering near the shelves. Trying to avoid eating over the books and dropping crumbs into them, so it's not to leave snacks behind for others. And then on nice days, if you bring your books outside and just sort of let the airflow go over them, it can be really helpful and just kind of get out that mustiness. But you don't want them to be outside for too long. So it's always a balance. Visible light can cause the dyes to fade in cloths and paper. And so both of these images here, you're seeing fading happen, but there wasn't a physical barrier between the light source and the book on display. So it can be really dramatic. Whereas UV wavelengths can cause a lot of chemical reactions to happen, and it'll result in yellowing, darkening, embrittlement of almost all materials of a book, as well as reduced mechanical strength because of that embrittlement. So trying to keep books out of intense light for prolonged periods and far enough away from the light that they're not getting the heat coming off the bulb, that can be really helpful. And then I know a lot of people tend to store books by windows. I do. But if you can, draw the blinds or sort of try and reduce the amount of UV exposure they are getting. This one is fairly explanatory, but if you have any sources of leaks or spills that get near books, you're going to see damage. So poor facilities are something to keep in mind and just regularly checking, especially if books are stored in windows that have gutters above them. Blocked up gutters can cause sort of flooding to happen, and just checking the envelope of the building. It should be noted that they're sort of different extremes of contact with water. If you spill some drinking water in a book, it's going to be a little bit less damaging than like a sewage backup that gets in contact with the book. But because books are predominantly water-based or fiber-based, they will absorb liquid. And when they do, they can become stained, wrinkled, the pages can stick together, the inks can run, adhesives become reversed, bindings fall apart. And wet books are really tricky to handle, so you can also cause further damage that way. So again, trying to keep books out of areas where you know there could be flooding, especially in the basements, trying to keep them off the ground. If they're a little bit wet, we recommend trying to open them up and putting them in front of a fan with cold air to circulate and help dry out the book. Slowing down the drying period will help reduce the amount of wrinkling you see. So you can also put heavy pieces of paper in between the pages to help soak up some of that water, put it under weight, and then change them out regularly until they're dry. If something is really, really waterlogged, what you can do is, if you're not prepared to work on it right away, you can put it in plastic and put a label on it and put it in the freezer, and that'll kind of pause the situation until you have the resources you need to then go about ensuring that you can dry it. When books do get wet, they are more susceptible for mold growth. And this is also with high relative humidity. And book materials, again, as with pests, lots of organic material being used, so it's a great food source for mold. If a mold occurs on a book, it can stay, distort, and weaken the book. And something to note is that the books, if there has been a high humidity event, and then the humidity in the environment goes down, the book can contain that moisture for longer than the external air. And so you might see mold growth after a humid event, but not necessarily at the same time. So it's just important to check even after you have sort of significant events like that. If you see mold, active mold is fluffy and tends to be three-dimensional. And old mold, or inactive mold, I should say, is powdery and flat. So just sort of visual indicators of what you're working with. Again, trying to control the environment, trying to keep your books and the shelves clean. If you do see mold, you should try and check the books around it to see if it's spread. If you are going to proceed with removing it, just make sure that you're working in good ventilation, you have the proper PPE on, so covering your nose and your mouth. And then you want to kind of gently brush or vacuum away the area of mold, but making sure that you don't then use that brush or vacuum head for other things like that is now contaminated. You don't want to spread the contamination. Again, taking your books, this is kind of going back to taking them outside, just letting them air out and having a little bit of light will actually help dry them as well. And then once items have experienced mold, they're more prone to get mold again, so just keeping an eye. And then, especially working in a library, we see this a lot. Improper handling causes the majority of damage. So if you can handle your books nicely, this will really help ensure that they're around for a while. So taking books off the shelf can cause damage at the spine, especially if you're pulling a book off the shelf from the head. You can start ripping the material where you're putting that pressure. Opening a book beyond how far it wants to be opened will damage the binding. If you kind of whack the shelf and put the book back in, you'll see a lot of damage at the board edges. Dropping of books, bending pages, using them as coasters. Dirty hands are a big one. The oils from the food and our skin can leave stains and become food sources. So reiterating myself again, keep yourself clean. If you want to take the book off the shelf safely, you can either pull from further along the head or you push in the two neighboring books and pull out the book from the spine. Don't open the book further than it wants to be opened, which is not always convenient, but will be the best. Shelves carefully, don't bend pages. Again, don't use them on a coaster. And then wash hands before handling books, especially old books, will be really, really helpful. Okay, and the home stretch. So in reference to what we said earlier about there's some elements of books that are just, you don't control them, they come as they are. And so part of that is the paper source. So especially from the 19th century and early 20th century, you are seeing that really poor paper. It tends to be yellowed, kind of old newspaper kind of paper. And it is very brittle. And part of that is because really harsh chemicals have been used on the wood pulp fiber, and it's become very short. And as paper degrades, the fiber length becomes shorter. And if it starts short, it doesn't have very far to go. So it can, as that chemical degradation happens, you can sort of have a vinegar smell, and then it also becomes yellow and brittle. There are acts to change that, and so a lot of paper now is fairly acidic free, but this is a pretty big indicator of sort of the era of the book that you have. So if you do have brittle paper, you're really trying hard not to crease it or bend it. Handling, especially if it's very bad, should be kept to a minimum. If you can take photos, even on your phone, but decent quality photos, and use that instead of the original, that can help kind of maintain the lifespan of that item. And again, you're trying to keep that out of UV light. And then the binding quality. So lots of reasons your book might fall apart. As we said, all those economic shortcuts. There was thin, leather began to be thinner as the centuries went on. So people didn't have to use as much material. And that thin leather can cause a lot of damage at the joints, so the boards will separate. It can also start to powder over time. And so it'll kind of coat your hands in a red powder, and it's very easy to spread. So don't wear white, especially around old books. You're having fewer anchor points at the end land to the text block. Like I said earlier, you can see that in the bottom image, it's sort of dangling. So when you do remove the book by the spine edge, you can also pull off that end band as well. On newer books, interestingly enough, they sort of overbind in a way. So in that bottom image, that red book, there's a very stiff spine, and it's so stiff that it's causing damage to the material it's bound in, over-engineered. And then you also have text blocks, especially textbooks, where the text block is so big, it sort of pulls away from the boards, and it does not have boards that can compensate for that weight. So you begin to see a lot of mechanical failure there. In these cases, some of the damage is going to happen, but again, careful handling will reduce a lot of the problems. Holding a book when you're reading it is really helpful instead of letting elements drape. When you, again, remove the book, remove it carefully from the shelf. And if you have really thick text blocks that you're afraid might have that sort of gravitational pull down, you can store them horizontally. So those are sort of the key takeaways for the binding itself. So thank you all for staying with me. That is the end. I would just like to thank the Dartmouth Libraries where I am now, my supervisor, Deborah Howe, and then also Buffalo, where I've been getting my master's degree. So yeah, all done. A question? Yes.
Several times you said clean the books regularly. How do you do that?
Oh, great question. So the sort of soft brush that a lot of vacuums might have sort of on the extension, you can go over the heads of the book. You kind of hold the spine in pinch motion, so you're kind of compressing the text block, and just kind of go over it is a really great way. Cleaning, again, vacuuming or using microfiber cloths to get cobwebs or clean the shelves is really helpful. Depending on what's happened to the books, if it seems like there's a little bit of food encrusted, you can kind of pick that off. Depending on if it's cloth and you use water, the cloth will absorb that water, so you might get staining. If it has more plastic cover, you're probably okay to use a little bit of water if there's something kind of globbed on. But yeah, vacuuming tends to be the best and quickest way to do it. Yeah.
Sometimes old books have a musty smell, but there's no visible mold. Could there be some invisible mold there, or is some other source?
There could be, especially there's a lot of nooks and crannies in a binding. There are lots of like little nooks and crannies in a binding. Part of it could be the paper itself, and then just if there hasn't been a lot of airflow, then you're just kind of getting that lingering sense. So that's where having kind of taking them out and opening them up so you can get that circulation can be really helpful. If it's reoccurring, then it might be something more than just sort of mustiness.
And also, like, sometimes when you read descriptions of old books, they'll say this book's in good condition but has some foxing. Those are like little brown marks, right?
Yes.
What is that?
So it's really interesting, actually. It's sort of it's explored, but we don't have a complete answer for what it is. It seems to be inherent to the paper process. So it seems like there could be, during the paper making, when they're taking the pulp out of the bath on a screen. For the Western paper, the screen tends to be metal, so there might be small metal inclusions in the paper. So it could be almost rusting.
Yeah.
It could be if there's something in the water source that they're using. It's only a visual impact. It doesn't affect the mechanical strength. And the only way to clean it is if you do a bleaching. So it's very authentic, if that makes you feel better, but I know it can discolor the actual object as well. Yeah.
We have a question, we have a comment from Jay online. It says, bravo, great job putting a lot of information into a concise and informative presentation. And we have a question from Angela. It says, and you've started to, I think, answer it a little bit. Can anything be done about old book smells?
Yeah. Mostly airing them out. Again, checking for mold is good, kind of seeing if there's any sort of growth. I don't know, would you
Airing out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
if it's
Or the cat litters.
oh, that's true, right? So cat litter, if it's a recurring issue and you've tried the other
Yeah.
steps, putting the book sort of on a open air tray, sort of think on the baking tray where you put cookies once they're cooling. If you put cat litter under that, the litter will absorb some of that odor.
Put it in like a.
Oh yeah, and you should put it in, yes, right. Wrap it in sort of a plastic or a bubble that'll help kind of filter that, so it's not just open to the air. Sort of
A microclimate.
a good step, yeah, just treat a microclimate, that's right.
We have another question online from Christopher, wants to know, do you have a favorite book that you've handled, owned, or worked on?
I found at a used bookstore, it's not very old, I think it's probably late 1800s, but it's got a leather binding and the leather still has the hair on it. And so it's a hairy spotty cow cover, which is, I know, very kind of grotesque, but it's such a testament to what kind of material they were using. It feels very unique, so I really like that one.
Do you remember what it's about?
It is a French book and it has the most cartoonish depictions. I don't read French, so I just sort of make up what it's about. But yeah, it's very entertaining.
Some my dad had an old book once. He kept it in a bookcase with a glass doors to protect it, you know. But I think that might have actually damaged it in some way. Is it like that not an ideal thing because then there's no airflow?
Yeah, so I imagine there's the element of like if you hold the magnifying glass in the light, you kind of get the heat buildup.
Right.
So it's, to some degree that could be a problem. And then the lack of airflow. It's going to be good for keeping out dust. So just sort of again opening them up, letting it sort of balance.
You could open the doors and just let air in.
Yeah, you can sort of let it circulate.
Yeah.
And kind of have both that physical barrier and then give it a chance to sort of air out as well. So the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, great, thank you so much.
Thank you.